Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar series, Navigating Celiac Disease with Gluten-Free Living. Today's seminar is about preparing for the safe holidays, gluten-free eating for Halloween and the upcoming holidays. My name is Nasim Khavari. I'm one of the physicians at Stanford Children's Hospital and part of the Celiac Center. And I'd love to introduce Vicki. Vicki, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Vicki Gainsberg, and I am a dietitian, registered dietitian at the University of Chicago Children's Hospital, Comer Children's Hospital in Chicago. And I also specialize in pediatric GI and celiac disease, GI, and various GI disorders.
So we thought we would start with just a small overview of what we're going to talk about today. We'll start with some of the challenges of the gluten-free holidays. Think about some tips to navigate these challenges, Halloween initially, and then later some of the other holidays that are coming up. We would love to make this as participatory as possible. We recognize that it's limited through the chat, but please feel free to put questions in the chat and just be patient with us, as there might be more or less ideal times for us to answer them, but we will certainly keep track of them. So as we're just thinking about the holidays coming up, I think probably everyone here knows that there's challenges of being gluten-free during the holidays, especially for kids. These include feelings of social isolation or feelings of exclusion when some people are allowed to eat certain foods and maybe they're not. Just feeling limited in terms of the number of treats that are actually gluten-free that they get to eat. Sometimes classroom celebrations might exacerbate that feeling if we haven't planned ahead as much, or even if we have. There might be peer pressure from people who don't understand why our kids or friends might need to be gluten-free, not knowing where the gluten is hidden and how do I even navigate this, or the feeling of missing out on certain traditions that go along with these holidays. So what are some of the key things we can do to try to navigate these challenges? And I'm sure many of you have already thought about this and are doing this anyway, but sometimes around the holidays, it's nice to just give extra reminders. One of them is just communication. So talking to teachers or school staff or parents of your child's friends if there's going to be a party, and just make them aware that your child can't have gluten or what their dietary restrictions might be. And that will help the planning ahead a little bit more. Secondly, remind your child about just the importance of their dietary restriction to stay strong and healthy, and teach them how to identify gluten-free foods and recognize the ingredients that contain gluten. And Vicki's got some really great slides and ideas and ways for us to all do this together, kids and adults alike. Third, safe treats. So prepare or purchase safe gluten-free holiday treats in advance. Involve your child or teens in cooking and the baking process to make it more fun and engaging so they're excited about what they're eating. And then think about the traditions that you want to have with your family and how can we adapt those traditions and recipes to be gluten-free. And they don't always have to be food related.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about tricks and treats for a gluten-free Halloween. So there's no need to be tricked by Halloween candy. And we're going to go over how to navigate identifying candies that are gluten-free and ones that are not safe. It's always important, as we know, to read labels. We always want to check directly with manufacturers if you're unsure, if the label is not clear, if the ingredients aren't clear. It's the best way. And also another thing with Halloween miniatures, I always encourage, making sure. I always encourage with Halloween miniatures. They're not always similarly ingredients, and they're also processed in different facilities. So they may not always be gluten-free, in regards to like their larger size counterparts. So that's always important to, again, check labels and ingredients for the Halloween miniatures. And also a lot of the Halloween fun size candies that are like pumpkin shaped. Some of those sometimes can't guarantee the gluten-free status. So in particular, like a Reese's peanut butter cup, I always say stick with like the original ones versus like the different shape ones. And then also, even if the candy does not have gluten containing ingredients, I always recommend verifying with the manufacturer if it is gluten-free. So here's a little fun interactive. This one shows two different Halloween chocolates. One is Hershey's Cookies and Cream Fangs, and the other is another Halloween candy, Hershey's Kisses Vampire. This one already shows a check, but as you can see, the Fangs is cookies and cream. Cookies does indicate, cookies which would have gluten or wheat in it. And the Hershey Kisses, these are going to be, again, safe for gluten-free. And this is another one. So Kit Kat. So which Kit Kat do you think is gluten-free? And I don't know if you want to put in the chat what you think. If anyone wants to answer this, I can wait a couple seconds if anyone's interested in putting in if they think any of these are gluten-free. Let's see. Did anyone put anything? Looks like not. So we can go ahead and say the next one. So it's a trick question. So actually none of those are gluten-free. They all contain wafers, which have wheat in them. And but here are a couple options for gluten-free versions of a gluten-free Kit Kat that are safe. So here we're gonna just look at a label together. Here's one. This is a typical candy, Milky Way. So as you can see on the bottom, in the ingredients, there's a couple ingredients that indicate that there is gluten. One is malted barley. So barley is an ingredient that has gluten in it. It's a grain that contains gluten. And then again, there's wheat flour, which also contains gluten. So this candy in particular is not gluten-free. And we can go to the next slide. But however, there are other Milky Ways. So there's lots of different varieties. So the Milky Way Midnight is gluten-free, does not contain the malted barley or the flour, the wheat flour, and also the caramel one is gluten-free. So this is another question, true or false? Twizzlers are gluten-free. Does anyone want to answer? Let's see. I can give a couple seconds to see. Because people sometimes think Twizzlers, this is like a get a little I think blindsided by Twizzlers because it's a lot of don't think a lot what the ingredients are. But again, on the next slide, Twizzlers do contain wheat. It is one of the main ingredients in licorice type candies, and it helps to bind the candy. But there are, if we go to the next slide, we got one question. Let's see, not gluten-free. You're right. These are options. Some of them aren't mainstream, but I think a lot of these can be found in different grocery stores. I found them in a lot of my local grocery stores in Chicago, but these are all safe, gluten-free. They do not contain wheat flour as an ingredient. So moving on to M&Ms. So there are so many different M&Ms, and I think people get so confused with M&Ms. But there's here you can see options of a crispy, which is an indicator of like some sort of cookie. Another, the crispy cocoa, there's a crispy regular, and then there's also this bottom one is a cookies and cream. So these all in the ingredient, just in the name, indicate some sort of crisp. So that's an indicator. Look at the ingredients, and those all three do contain malted barley or wheat flour, and they are not gluten-free. But the other two, the milk chocolate and the peanut, so these are like the original candies of M&Ms, and these are safe and they are gluten-free. So this is another trick question, true or false. All candy corn has gluten in it. Do people think it has gluten in it? So to answer, that's actually false. There are plenty of candy corns that actually are gluten-free, and all three of these do not contain any gluten and are gluten-free. See, would you have a question? False. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the
next for the answers. Keep them coming.
I know, keep them coming. So here's a list I put together, and there are more, but these are like a lot of the typical candies you see for trick or treating that actually do not contain any gluten ingredients and are safe. So as you can see, a lot of these are the original candies, and I always like to say, like, stick to the basic candies here. Don't go, there's a lot of like offshoots of like the peanut butter cups and the milk chocolate bars, but if you stick to a lot of the basic candies that are original, these are going to be the ones that are typically do not contain any gluten ingredients. When you get into the cookies and the crisps, these are where there's wheat and other gluten that can be in there. So as you can see in this list alone, there are tons of gluten-free options for your children. And these are a lot of the candies that people put out for trick-or-treating also. So just a few other tips on, trick-or-treating. I always say, maybe have your children go out with them and trick or treat first and then kind of enjoy the candy later. So come home and look through it and see what is safe for your child. Separate it out even. I have a child with celiac, and I always have them pour out the bag. We separate out the gluten containing candies and the gluten-free. Obviously, they're all going to be in package, so even if they're in a bag together, they're going to be fine, the gluten and the gluten-free, as long as they don't eat them. So separate them out, and just either my son will give them away, or sometimes you can even have them exchange what I said here. The unsafe candy can be collected for like maybe a little toy, a small gift, and then that's less candy too. And then a lot of just another few things would be like, just remember those mini size favorites are going to be a little different, the ingredients sometimes, than the larger parts. So always read the labels. I always encourage reading labels and being aware of what candies are safe for your child. And just, I always like to say like they are trick-or-treating, and kids are eating the candy. Pack a few gluten-free candies, for them that they are safe, and just, be like, here, have this. We can wait and look through the bag until we get home.
Vicki, there's a question in the chat that says, do all mini candies still have full ingredient lists on them?
Which one? Do all mini candies still have a full ingredient list on them? So usually a lot of them don't. So you would have to look them up online. But in, like, say if you bought like a bag, they do have the ingredients in the bag itself. But obviously if you're trick-or-treating, you don't have a lot of those individual ones. Say to check, go online and check your manufacturer for the ingredient list. Because I think they're too small to put everything in there.
Thanks for all those great ideas. Here are just a few additional ones. One, and this is related to what Vicki just said, have some safe treats that you have already bought yourself on hand. So before Halloween, purchase the gluten-free candies and treats that your child can enjoy. A second option is you can go homemade, and you can see by some of these cute homemade ideas below. There is a lot of room with like marshmallows and sprinkles and Rice Krispie treats and other ways that obviously make sure they're the gluten-free ones, but that you can try. And then for the kids that do come home with a bunch of gluten-containing candy, can encourage them to trade with somebody who can't eat gluten, so they don't feel like they're missing out so much. Maybe with their siblings or friends, with some of the other, or with the treats that you've bought already in advance. In addition to that, think about Halloween traditions that don't necessarily involve food. So like a glow-in-the-dark treasure hunt, and you can organize it with your kids around the house or with some friends, and you might include some gluten-free candies or small toys for the kids to find. You can have a pumpkin decorating party, which is another nice tradition that a lot of kids like, or just think about some fun, crafts that you guys could do together. Costume parades, which a lot of the schools often do, but you guys could arrange, or we could arrange. Halloween movie nights, or other Halloween themed games like bobbing for apples, or like a Halloween themed scavenger hunt. Are there any questions specific to Halloween that anybody would like to put in the chat? And if they come to you later, we can answer them later at the end as well. We'll move to the holidays, but feel free to add any questions if they come up. So how about the other holidays that come after Halloween? How do we think about making those gluten-free? So a lot of the principles are really similar to what we were just talking about with Halloween. Learn about and understand where are the gluten sources that are in traditional holiday dishes so that we can think about planning for those a little bit better. Communicate your dietary needs to host a restaurant. So if you always go to some friends or family's home, talking to them in advance can really help. Plan, which I know sounds obvious, but planning ahead always makes a huge difference in order to just be able to bring and have enough gluten-free options available. Thinking about gluten-free stuffing and gravy alternatives, which Vicki is going to help us talk about in a little bit more detail in just a minute. Thinking about how to prevent cross-contamination, especially if like everyone is cooking together in the kitchen and you're maybe outside of this safer home gluten-free kitchen environment. And then thinking about what dessert options we have. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail too. So sort of specifics to think about, a lot of the gluten-free turkeys or tofu turkeys actually have sort of, if you're using a pre-made rub, they often have some sort of thickener or gluten added. So make sure that you look for hidden gluten ingredients, which once again, Vicki's going to show us in a minute. Similarly, when you're thinking about stuffing, which is traditionally often full of bread, you can look for gluten-free options or use other things like gluten-free cornbread or rice or quinoa for delicious stuffing alternatives. Make sure that you probably make your own gravy or you use cornstarch or gluten-free flour if you're going to make it at home, or if it's pre-made, make sure it's gluten-free. And then there's a lot of gluten-free sides that are actually traditionally gluten-free, like mashed potatoes or roasted vegetables or cranberry sauce or sweet potato. You just have to make sure that whatever you add to it doesn't have gluten. And then, of course, gluten-free desserts, which we have some more ideas for in a minute.
Okay, so we're going to get into like a little bit more, nitty gritty of these ingredients, but here's a picture of various pictures of typical holiday ingredients. So some, have gluten in them, and some actually, at what Nasim said, are naturally gluten-free choices. So we'll get into talking about a little bit more about all these different ingredients. So particularly the next one, gravy. So gravy, we're going to start with gravy. So gravy, as Nasim said, does have, your typical McCormick gravy is going to have that wheat or gluten in it. But there are plenty of great gluten-free alternatives. McCormick's even has a gluten-free option, and there is a couple different prepackaged gluten-free gravy mixes that you can find in the grocery stores nowadays. We are so lucky and fortunate to have a lot of alternatives that are gluten-free of these products. So you don't always have to make them from scratch, but that is always an option too. With making a gravy, you can use cornstarch, you can use a gluten-free all-purpose flour mix, various different thickeners that, the different grains that are gluten-free work wonderfully with making a good homemade gravy. Next is the broths and bouillon. So there can be hidden gluten in sometimes some chicken broths, beef broths, and bouillon cubes. They tend to have wheat starch in them, or like a hydrolyzed yeast extract, barley malt sometimes. So again, it's really imperative to read ingredients for like broths and bouillons to make sure that they are safe and gluten-free. There are tons of alternatives out there. And that's one thing I always like to encourage with, if you are going to a household, a friend's house or family, sometimes they don't realize some of these ingredients too are not gluten-free. So, you may be even investigating a little further of what, if they using broth or bouillon, which ones they purchased or use, or maybe just let them know in advance if they are going to be making something that would contain these ingredients. Next is your typical cream of mushroom soup or cream of chicken soup that would be used for like making casseroles, green bean casserole, different casseroles. They use a lot of these in holiday cooking. And your typical Campbell's does contain wheat in them. So that's also not something to be aware of. But there are, again, many alternatives that you can purchase that you, as you can see, there's a whole host of list here that Progresso makes one. There's a Health Valley Organics. There's a ton at Whole Foods and different grocery stores that do have cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soups that are safe and gluten-free. The next one is, again, stuffing, your typical stuffing. So obviously your typical stuffing is going to have bread, which is made from gluten. So this is something that, of course, like we gluten-free you cannot have. But again, there are plenty of gluten-free stuffing mixes, from Trader Joe's to Aldi to a brand name of Glutino, different that you can do the same as like your typical Stouffer's. You basically, it's the same idea, just using gluten-free bread mix. And of course, you can always make your own too, using gluten-free bread and using different, obviously, gluten-free ingredients and making a homemade stuffing that way too. So the choices I feel like are really, you have a lot to choose from for the gluten-free stuffings. And they're actually fairly good if you guys, I'm not sure if you guys have tried them before, but they taste really good. And next is cornbread. So a lot of people think like corn is used with cornmeal, but cornmeal, which is gluten-free, but oftentimes, usually the mainstream cornbread mixes are going to have not just cornmeal in them, but also wheat flour together. Both of them are going to be in there. So those are not going to be safe for celiac. But again, there are tons of alternatives that have gluten-free alternatives where you can find gluten-free bread mixes. Bob's Red Mill, as you can see here, King Arthur, Krusty's, Pamela's, and they obviously use a gluten-free flour and cornbread and cornmeal. And you can also, which I love to do, I make a cornbread stuffing using the gluten-free cornbread mixes, and then I put in different veggies and different things like that and make my own stuffing with using the gluten-free cornbread mixes, which is also a really good option. And then next, we're just going to go over, let's see here, what's next? Oh, the baking. So baking, so again, like gluten-free baking, there are, it takes a little bit. I feel like if you're just starting out gluten-free and trying to try some new baking, there are some great mixes out there that I love to use, so you don't have to like spend lots of money on different flours and ingredients, but there's King Arthur has some great, they have pie crust mix, and they have cake mixes and brownie mixes and cookie mixes, and they're like just as simple as like your regular cake, standard baking mixes. They're really easy and they come out really great. But if you want to try your hand at homemade, that's always an option too. I love using the gluten-free all-purpose flours. There's the one from Bob's Red Mill, and then also King Arthur has an all-purpose gluten-free flour. So it's like takes the place of like regular all-purpose flour. So and that's actually a good way to, if say you have some recipes that you've been using in the past that have, obviously regular flour, come from family members have used and stuff like that, you can always substitute the gluten-free all-purpose flour for that type of recipe for regular all-purpose flour. And I love that it comes out just as well. There are a few other tricks you can always, if things you feel like it doesn't taste as good, sometimes I recommend adding an extra egg, sometimes using a little more butter, using milk as an ingredient instead of water can make it a little more tastier. And then I always recommend bringing all ingredients to room temperature, and that's typical anyway, but keeping your eggs room temperature, the butter, the milk, all that stuff. Sometimes having the batter sit for a little bit helps develop a little bit of structure versus putting in the oven right away. And sometimes baking it a little less, like a little the temperature a little less, 25 degrees less, can help also with the baking too. But it is like, one of those things, if you want to do homemade, I love it's something fun. You can do it with your kids. It's a fun way. You can set your own holiday traditions with using different ingredients and different mixes, and you're just having fun with it too.
So,
and then, this is yours.
so back to some sort of tricks and tips to think about. Once again, plan ahead. So maybe sit with your family or your kids to figure out what are the dietary restrictions. Is it just gluten? Are there other things? And then try to plan a menu with them in advance so that, you know, if they love, like, especially if this is like their first, you know, gluten-free holiday, this is what I really think I'm going to miss. And then you guys can plan ahead and try some things together and make a menu. Related to what Vicky was just saying, make it a fun and collaborative effort. You can encourage guests to bring gluten-free dishes to share or involve other family members to help prepare the meal. Just make sure to teach them about cross-contamination. And then think about a creative presentation. So especially if you are having a mixed gluten containing and gluten-free meal, maybe put the things that you're worried about contamination in a separate mason jar, or make a separate gluten-free dessert bar, or somewhere where it's labeled and separate, where the cross-contamination isn't an issue, but it's still fun and cute and people are still really excited about it. And then think about games and activities. So once again, like beyond the food, what are the things that make this holiday special, and how can we spend time together, whether it's board games or charades or a craft station or other themed games or activities. And then lastly, express gratitude. We know that's helpful for so many different reasons, but just remembering that the holidays are also about just being thankful for what we have and for our health and for all the people that we get to interact with, even beyond the food. And sometimes that helps make the gluten-free not feel as tough for some people.
So just a few other last tips and tricks. You know, with holidays and stuff, I always say if it is a big group and you know, try to like serve yourself for, you know, get ahead of the line. Don't be greedy, but like, you know, just try to maybe to prevent the cross contamination, you know, try to get your food first. I always like to recommend what Nasim said, like separate, maybe getting separate stations, having like a little table which has all the gluten-free items on it. I also like using those aluminum foil tins. I know that, you know, because less cross-contamination with other types of, you know, bakeware that could be contaminated if you're at someone else's house. You know, again, contribute a gluten-free dish or two. Like I love to bring stuff to people's houses because I know it's going to be gluten-free and I know I'll be able to eat it. So, you know, bring a dessert, bring a couple sides, you know, and so you know that there are some safe things along with a few other things that, you know, you've talked to the host about. You can always color code the serving bowls and utensils to make sure that these are the gluten-free items too. Again, talk to your host ahead of time, ahead of the event, just to, you know, tell them your allergies, tell them your children's allergies, and let them know your concerns and find out exactly what they're going to be making. For as you know, for me, I always know like if when I'm making things, I always like to, you know, sometimes you can't get every gluten-free item at one grocery store. So I always like to kind of make a list, split the grocery shopping in a few, you know, a few different trips to not make it so stressful. So, you know, like one day I'll go to this store and get these things, and the other day I'm going to go here and buy the other things that I need. I also, you know, keep lots of extra serving spoons around because sometimes person might put a, you know, take a serving spoon, serve it, you know, scoop it up and then use it for a different dish too. So have them around so they can kind of keep the serving spoons different, you know, keep them from swapping between dishes. And then again, I always like to say, like, if you're unsure of something and not sure, and the other person you've asked and inquired, like, what's in this, and they're not really sure, just not, don't have it, skip that dish, because I'm sure there's going to be plenty of other food out there, items out there that you'll be able to eat.
Thanks
And
for those awesome tricks and tips. If you have a tip or trick that we didn't mention or just any other ideas, we would love to invite people to put those in the chat, and we can try to share them with everyone, whether it's a tradition or a gluten-free idea.
or
Or
questions on candies or anything like
yeah,
that, or ideas for products. I have celiac. I've been celiac for over 20 years, so I'm pretty feel like I know a lot about the gluten-free food out there and items and especially ingredients.
And there is a Q&A feature if anybody is more comfortable. I don't know if you guys can see it, but please feel free to put anything in the Q&A if you feel comfortable. Or feel free to ask your doctor or dietitian separately if that's more comfortable. Ooh, here's one. It says, I freeze the ends of gluten-free bread to make homemade croutons. Super easy.
That is a great idea.
Thanks for sharing. We will give one more minute for anyone who has additional recommendations or questions. Vicky, do you want to tell us some of your favorite gluten-free holiday dishes?
So I always make cornbread stuffing using like I usually buy like the Trader Joe's cornbread mix, which is great. I don't know if you guys have ever tried their cornbread, the gluten-free cornbread, but I use that and I make a stuffing with different veggies and I use chicken broth and I put it in the oven and everyone loves that dish. Another thing I wanted also was mashed potatoes. Those are typically gluten-free, just potatoes with my husband usually makes them lots of butter and milk and stuff, so they're very creamy, but those typically can be usually are gluten-free naturally. I think there's another question here. Do we see something? Are there
Yeah, are there
beverages that would contain gluten that you should be on the lookout for? So that's a good question. So I mean, most like flavored something things that are flavored could have gluten, like especially alcohols that are flavored. We don't Where is that flavor coming from? But if typically like regular wines and obviously no beer that's regular malted beer with wheat is not is does not has gluten in it. But other beverages like mulled wine would be safe. What other holiday beverages? I'm like think what else is there for eggnog, that's a holiday beverage. So that typically would be okay. It's usually like milk and cream and sugar, and then they typically add some sort of alcohol, whether it be like rum, right? Isn't that right? What's in eggnog? And rum would be is one of those ingredients. Alcohols that is what's safe. Um, So the main things would be beer and any flavored liquors that could have potential gluten in them. Um, Eggnog could be safe. It just depends on the other ingredients. But like if you bought eggnog, like refrigerated eggnog, there's no gluten in that. But it depends if they're making like homemade and maybe they're adding some flavorings. You'd have to ask. But if it's like they're like a store-bought eggnog, that's fine. Alcoholic, non-alcoholic. So most non-alcoholic like ciders, apple cider, like cranberry drinks, things like that are going to be safe. They're juicy type beverages. Sprouted brand has gluten-free fried onions or green bean casserole. Great Value brand has a gluten-free cream. There we go. There's some brands that someone is mentioning that has gluten-free fried onions for like to make a green bean casserole, which is great. That's awesome. And then there is Great Value brand has a gluten-free cream and mushroom soup to make like also the green bean casserole. I also love making pies. So like a pumpkin pie, I usually buy like a ready-made gluten-free crust. I don't tend to make the crust because it takes more time, but there are lots. Whole Foods has a couple brands that are gluten-free crust in the refrigerated section. And then you just make the pie filling itself is just pumpkin and usually condensed milk and spices and sugar. So it's clearly safe. Typically there's no flour or anything added to pumpkin pie. Any other ingredient tips anyone has?
They've all been really awesome ideas and suggestions. Thank you. Thank you, Vicky, for all the awesome ideas, and thanks for those who were able to participate in the Q&A, and also just all of you for joining us and coming. We really appreciate it and look forward to seeing you guys next month for the next Navigating Celiac. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.